Hello, everyone, and welcome to Talk Nerdy. Today is Monday, December 5th, 2022, and I'm the host of the show, Cara Santa Maria. And this week, before we dive into our episode, I do want to thank those of you who make Talk Nerdy possible. Remember, Talk Nerdy is and will always be 100% free to download. That's because I rely on the support of both my advertisers and patrons just like you. If you're interested in supporting the show, all you've got to do is visit Patreon, patreon.com/talknerdy. This week's top patrons include Daniel Lang, David J.E. Smith, Mary Neva, Brian Holden, David Compton, Gabrielle F. Jaramillo Gonzalez, Joe Wilkinson, Leonard Prince, Pasquale Gelati, Ulrika Hagman, and so many more. I want to thank you all from the bottom of my heart for your ongoing and just like incredible support. All right. What have I got for you this week? Well, this week I had the opportunity to chat with Dr. Erin Macdonald. She's an astrophysicist and also a writer and producer. And currently she's the science consultant for the entire Star Trek franchise. She has a brand new book, a board book actually. So this is for littles called Star Trek, My First Book of Space. And we're going to talk about all things science, science consulting, science advising, science in Hollywood. So without any further ado, here she is, Dr. Erin Macdonald. Well, Erin, thank you so much for joining me today.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I'm really excited to be here.
Me too. I'm excited to talk about my first book of space. And even more than that, I'm excited to talk about Star Trek. I'm excited to talk about astrophysics. It's funny because I am, maybe I shouldn't say this right up front, but I feel like my listeners already know it and you probably don't. I am not a big sci-fi fan.
Oh,
I know. But I work. So this is my podcast, and it's nerdy and awesome. And like everybody who listens is into this stuff. And then also I work on another podcast, The Skeptic's Guide to the Universe. And those guys are bananas sci-fi fans. And that's not to say I don't like sci-fi. And truth be told, Star Trek, I grew up watching Next Generation with my mom.
Oh, awesome.
Yeah, like that was my Star Trek, was next Generation. And definitely Star Trek when it comes to sci-fi is like my kind of sci-fi. It's social, it's relevant, it's techie, but not overly obsessive about technology. And it's not fantasy. I have a hard time with sci-fi fantasy.
Understood. Yeah, it's definitely its own sort of, it treads a nice line. We talk about science fiction as this big spectrum between science and fiction. And you always have to like ask where people like to live in that realm. And yeah, I think Star Trek really kind of hits right in the middle of it. It's very allegorical, it's scientific, but it's not overly so. Just the way you described it. Absolutely.
Okay, awesome. Good. I feel the same way, but I'm by no means an expert. So you're going to have to bring in your expertise for us. I may not get all of your references, but don't worry, the people listening probably will.
Excellent.
All right. So before we dive into like what you're doing now in the book, I mean, everybody's like, wait, what's going on? I've already introduced you. So maybe they're not like, wait, what's going on? I time travel a little when I record. I want to go back to the beginning because you're an astrophysicist. Were you always into STEM? Is this something that you knew you wanted to do growing up? Is it something you found later? Like what was your path, let's say pre-college?
Yeah, it's so funny. Like, we lump all those questions in together. Like, were you into space? What did you want to, did you want to be a scientist when you grew up? And I think for me growing up, like I was really into space and science, but I didn't know what I wanted to be, like I didn't see that as a career. I was exposed to amazing characters in the form of particularly Dana Scully for me as a 90s girl watching the X-Files, a little redheaded kid. And the idea that like she was just cool, and she was a scientist and she would put on a lab coat and I just thought she was really cool. And so my goal was to like become Dana Scully, not like a medical doctor who works for the FBI. And then also the film Contact was pretty influential for me as well. Dr. Ellie Arroway is just a really cool, complex woman scientist in that as an astronomer. And so I was drawn to these characters, and I always loved film and television. I was really obsessed with like behind the scenes stories, and just seeing how these stories that I loved came to be. So that's sort of the context and what my passions were, what my interests were. And then as I started to approach, being in high school and college, again, I really loved science and I liked doing it. And my parents were like, "Well, then you better freaking go get a degree in it because that'll benefit you." In their opinion, it would benefit me better than going to film school. And they were also helping support me through college, so they had a little bit of a say in what I was going into. And then just when I realized that you could literally go to university and study space for 4 years, like that's what appealed to me. Becoming an astronomer or an astrophysicist wasn't necessarily the goal. I just liked the idea that I could go and just concentrate and just learn more about space.
So you kind of knew before you even started college, like maybe not what you wanted to do for a living, but you knew that you wanted to study astro. And so as an undergrad, I'm always curious about like what schools people to go to and what degrees are offered, because like even my master's level degree is 100% neuroscience. Every class I took was a neuroscience class, but they didn't offer a degree in neuroscience, so my
Wow.
diploma says biology.
Yeah.
Because it was like within the biological sciences. So did your school offer an astrophysics degree, an astronomy degree? Like what did you actually study as an undergrad?
Oh gosh, yeah. I'm going to try to make this story as short as possible, but it's
No,
one I like.
don't. We have time.
Okay.
I love stories.
Okay, because it's like I think it's really important, especially when I talk to high school kids, to hear a little bit about my college experience, because I find high school kids put so much pressure on themselves if they're interested in going to college to like choosing the right college and choosing the right major. And I wanted to study astrophysics. That's what I had like discovered and what I was interested in. And I grew up in Colorado. So I wanted to get away. I wanted to move as far away as possible and get out of the house and find my independence and all those things. And again, motivated by television and movies, Contact, took place at the Very Large Array. That's where it kicks off in New Mexico. So I was like, well, that must be where the astrophysics is. And so I looked at the University of New Mexico and I got a scholarship to go there, just a partial scholarship. And they offered an astrophysics degree. So I was like, okay, I'm going to go here. This is where Contact happens. So I can be a year away. All the logic is making sense in my brain. I get to be away from Colorado. And then I went there, and with all the love to people who have gone to the University of New Mexico, I had a terrible time. Like, I just wasn't vibing with the university, with the professors, like whatever it was, I just didn't feel comfortable. I didn't quite fit in. And it just wasn't working for me. And I was expressing this to one of my professors who could see that I was really struggling. And they kind of held me to task, and they just said, like, Erin, you're from Colorado. Like, if you want to do astrophysics and you get in-state tuition, go to CU Boulder. Like, what are you doing here? University of Colorado Boulder is one of the top astrophysics universities. But I didn't want to go there because half my high school class was going there. That was like all I knew.
You're like, it's too close to home.
Exactly. It was like the party school that half my class went to. And so I had no interest in that. And once they said that, this was in my freshman year, and I looked into it and I went and visited, when I was on break, and I was like, oh my God, like this could actually work. And the big appeal for me was the ability to do research. So Colorado doesn't offer a degree in astrophysics. They offer an astronomy degree or a physics degree with a concentration in astrophysics. And so, like you said, with your neuroscience, like my degree is in physics, but all of my senior classes were in astrophysics. And so I transferred, and that was the best decision I could have made. And it had very little impact in the sense that I still graduated in 4 years. I actually dual majored with mathematics. And I just that's kind of what I like to convey to students who put so much pressure on choosing the right college and the right degrees. Like, you can change your mind. If it doesn't work, you can change your mind. And it might be hard, but it's possible. And so I like to convey that. But yeah, so I went to the University of Colorado. And like I said, I think the big draw for me and why I would encourage people, if they have the means to do it, is the undergraduate research that I was able to do. I started right when I got there as my second semester as a sophomore. I started doing radio astronomy, just straight up research.
Oh,
And
okay.
that was a really cool experience.
Okay, cool. So radio astronomy, let's dig into that a little bit. We have touched on it before on the show, but I think it's been quite some time. So maybe you can give us a little bit of a background about sort of like the electromagnetic spectrum, how we study the cosmos, and like the different tools that we have available to us.
Perfect. Absolutely. So I'm going to take a step back, and because you asked about how we study the cosmos, and I've thrown around astrophysics and astronomy, and those are kind of two distinct things. There's a lot of similarities, but astronomy is very much the observation side of studying what the universe is giving us. We can't create a lot of this stuff in a lab, so astronomers build telescopes, they take in all this data, and they try to, just kind of document what's going on in space. And then the overlap with astrophysics is that you very much are applying physical laws to try to figure out why that star looks the way it does, or why the galaxy is shaped the way it is. So you have this sort of back and forth between observation and physics. And when it comes to professional astronomy, those really meld into one and the same. But just because people hear those terms, that's kind of when we refer to astronomy versus astrophysics, it's really like the observation versus the application of that, if that makes sense.
Yeah. That definitely makes sense. Okay, cool. Well, I'm going to use it completely incorrectly for the rest of the hour, I'm sure.
Excellent. No worries. You get one shot and that's it.
Yeah, I'll try. You correct me. Please correct me.
So when I say that I did radio astronomy, what I was doing was, there was a professor there at the university who was conducting his own research and had some money for undergraduate researchers. And so radio astronomy takes place in the lowest energy part of the electromagnetic spectrum. We talk about light, electromagnetic radiation, we see in the visible part of the spectrum. But that form of light, and you can think of light as a wave or a particle, but for this purpose, it's easier to think of it as a wave. These really long wavelength, low energy, like imagine just like a slinky, like all the way stretched out, is going to be in the radio part of the spectrum. And then as it starts to gain more energy, those wavelengths get closer together, or the frequency goes up, whichever of those phrases connect better for you. It moves, into microwave and infrared, which is heat, and then visible, which is what we see. Predator sees in the infrared, we see invisible. And then it goes up to ultraviolet, and that's where you start to get into like the more dangerous electromagnetic radiation, which is ultraviolet, which gives us sunburns. And then X-ray, and up into gamma rays, which are really, really bad for you. So it's all just about like how much energy is being carried by this force that we call light. So it's and what's interesting is different physical processes will emit in different parts of the spectrum. So I mentioned that like infrared is thermal radiation, it's heat. It's how the predator sees in the wavelength. And I always use film and television as reference points because I think like people are like, oh yeah, I saw Predator. Oh, okay. Like that works. But you're giving off heat. We emit light in the infrared part of the electromagnetic spectrum, but different physical processes. When stars explode, that will be in the high energy, that'll be X-rays and gamma rays. Cold hydrogen gas, so literally just gas that is sitting out in space. If anything sort of slightly heats it up, it's going to excite the electrons, which will fall back down. And when they fall, they emit radio waves. We can get into more of that process if you want, but essentially what you look for in the radio part of the spectrum, one of the things is just cold hydrogen gas. And let me take a beat right here just to emphasize that when we observe things in space, we're either observing stuff that's being emitted, so it's giving off something, or it's reflecting. So something's hitting it and then it's bouncing off of it. That's the only way we can see stuff when we're...
Right, because it has to be going towards, or I shouldn't say towards us, because that it has to be going outward from the thing. So either the thing is producing the thing that's going outward, or it's bouncing off of it.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay.
And so typically in astronomy, we observe in the electromagnetic spectrum of stuff that is emitted, or it's not there, it's absorbed. It should be there and it got absorbed by something, or it got reflected. And so when I worked in radio astronomy, what I was doing was I was searching for cold hydrogen gas. Now, the way that works is you essentially are shining a flashlight at the telescope. And if a cloud of fog moved in front of it, that light would dim and we could say that there's a cloud there. So that's effectively what I was doing as an undergraduate.
Okay. All right. And then did you continue that as you moved forward? Or did you say, like, okay, that was interesting. I learned a lot. I have new skills, but also this taught me what I don't want to do. And so now I'm going to move into what I do want to do. Because that's what happened to me. And I know a lot of people who went that route. And I know other people who just kind of continued the course.
Yeah. I mean, to some extent, like one of the things that I did find was that I loved doing research. I really enjoyed the process of doing research. I was kind of always like a B student. You know, I struggled through because I enjoyed the science, but it wasn't something that came naturally to me. But I really found an affinity for doing research. But like you said, I found myself more drawn to big things that go kablooey.
Yeah.
And less so much cold gas clouds that are hanging out between galaxies. So I was looking for opportunities, and I actually had always wanted to study abroad. I grew up in a first generation Scottish American household, and I had always wanted to go live in Scotland for some part of my life. And I never got to study abroad. And so I started looking at graduate programs overseas. And
okay.
there was a professor at the University of Glasgow who was looking for PhD students. He had come from radio astronomy, but actually was now working in gravitational waves, which is a whole other field of astrophysics. But it all kind of came perfectly together for me, especially when we talk about what PhD programs are like. And because, as I mentioned earlier, I never wanted to I never had this goal of professionally being a professor or a researcher. I just liked science and I wanted to keep studying it. The PhD programs in the UK were much more attractive to me than American PhD programs.
Okay.
Yeah. And it's just because it's basically, there's no difference in quality. It's just, you have to have a lot of research experience going into the UK because it's effectively the last 3 or 4 years of an American STEM PhD, where you walk in. Like, I had to propose my thesis as part of my PhD application to even go to graduate school. And that professor helped me write it. But I showed up on day one and they said, all right, there's your desk. See you in 3 years with a PhD thesis.
Wow.
So you have to kind of know how to do research at that point, right? You have to understand what the process is and know that it's something you're interested in doing. And thankfully I was prepared for that. And so that's kind of how I ended up going to Glasgow and how I kind of got into that PhD program.
Can I say that I appreciate that you did not come home with a Glaswegian accent?
You give me a dram of whiskey, it'll come out real fast.
Oh, but that's lovely. Do you miss it? Do you miss being there?
I do. I really, really loved Scotland. I really just felt at home there. And Glasgow is such a welcoming city because it's not super touristy, but it has just so much rich history of scientists and innovators and artists. And yeah, I felt alive in Glasgow. And yeah, I just try to get back as much as I can.
I love that so much. Okay. So you did, this work in gravitational astrophysics. You finished your work, you're kind of like sit down, do it, get that research done in 3 years, which is bananas. So you were young. I'm looking at your bio now and I'm like, girl, you finished your PhD at the age of 25. Yeah. By the way, I am in my final year of my PhD right now. And don't get me wrong, I had a whole other career and went back to work. But I'm going to finish, barring any unforeseen complications, I'm going to finish 2 months before my 40th birthday.
Congratulations. I'm not going to
Thank
ask
you.
you how it's going. I'm not going to ask you anything more than that because I know not to do that.
Yeah,
But
you know what's up. You know what's
yeah,
up.
but congratulations. You got this.
So then after you did your PhD, you did do a postdoc, right? I'm seeing that you were at LIGO.
That's right. Yeah, my PhD was part of LIGO as well. So LIGO is the Laser Interferometer Gravitational Wave Observatory. And when I was doing it, no one had ever heard of it. Like, no one had heard of it. This was the group that's trying to detect what are called gravitational waves from extreme events in our universe. And basically to prove Einstein's theory of gravity. And is incredibly challenging. I talked about how we observe using electromagnetic radiation. This is a whole other way of observing what happens in our universe, basically through the physical motion of our universe. So it's like feeling what's happening in space as opposed to seeing it. So I did my PhD, and again, because I didn't have this life goal of becoming a professor, but at this point I'm like, oh God, what do I do after this? Like, I don't know what I'm doing. One of the professors in my department gave me some really good advice. He was like, look, you could just be burnt out from doing your PhD, or like this couldn't be for you. You know, if you're feeling like you want to get out of academia, it could be either of those things. If you have a chance to take a postdoc, just take it. It's like 2 to 3 years. And then at least you'll get some distance from your PhD, and it'll give you some breath to like think about what you want to do. Because if you leave now and decide you want to come back, it's much harder.
Right. Yeah. That postdoc is really necessary. Did you take any time off in between?
Nope.
Wow, you went straight through. I can't do it. I've already told myself I need 3 months. I need 3 months to
God.
to recalibrate my life.
Yeah, I moved a week after I defended my PhD.
No, everyone does that. All of my cohort is doing that. I'm like, good luck. Good luck with the burnout.
You're doing the right thing. I definitely hit a wall. But
yeah.
But I didn't have the pressure. It became a job, though, at that point, you know.
Well, and also, to be fair, you were 25 and I'm 39. And
right.
I do think there's like a difference in our work-life balance capacities, you know, between those age groups, too.
Concur. I would not do that now. I'll put it that way.
Right. Yeah.
So I did the postdoc. I went to Cardiff University, continued to work in gravitational waves. Again, this is all before they made the detection. So it was a pretty small niche part of astronomy. And then I did decide academia wasn't for me. And unfortunately, because of the immigration laws that Theresa May put in 2012 when she took over as the Home Secretary, I had to leave. Like, I had no option. So I basically was just kicked out of the country. It was like, you can either stay in academia or you have to leave the country. Mm-hmm. So I moved back to Colorado, and I was really lost for a long period of time.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I think it's so important, and like I'm really grateful that you're sharing that, because I think a lot of people just assume in science there's this, you know, straight and narrow path. There's always something kind of waiting around the corner. But like, scientists are people. Scientists get burnt out. They go back home. They get sad. They get lonely, and like it's important to kind of be open about that.
Yeah. And I think, too, we don't talk enough about the underemployment of PhDs. You know, I think so many people assume if you have a PhD, you have a great job and tons of income and your life is super stable. And it's like, I was working at Starbucks and teaching community college classes and working part-time at the museum, like just to make ends meet. And that was rough. That was really, really hard.
Yeah. And so how then the transition, because clearly then you went into consulting, kind of science. What would the word be for what you do? Like, you're a consultant, right?
Yeah. So I did manage to find a job actually working as a technical consultant for the federal government while I was back in Colorado. Thankfully that paid a little bit better. That got my feet back under me. And I it was a fine job. It was a good job. But in parallel to all of this, when I left academia, I really missed teaching. I discovered I really loved teaching. And one of the things that I started doing as a way to fill that void was going to sci-fi conventions and teaching the science of science fiction. I would talk about the science of Star Trek or how artificial gravity would work or how, lightsabers could work and all that fun stuff. And so once I got my feet back under me, I realized that like I really want to live in Los Angeles. If I can't live in Scotland, I've always wanted to live in LA because that early passion and love for filmmaking. So I transferred my job out to LA Air Force Base and I moved out here. And after those 5 years or so of going to these conventions, I had met a lot of writers and creatives and people who worked in the industry that once I was kind of in LA, I started getting connected to work on projects as you described as a consultant or an advisor. And so people would call me, whether they're like just coming up with ideas, whether they're writing novels or comic books or podcasts or movies or TV shows. And they would just say like, hey, can I run this past you? And the job sometimes it started to get more formalized. So I was brought on more for like specific TV shows. And then I got into Star Trek.
Love it. And so since 2019, you've been like the Star Trek science advisor.
Yeah, it's pretty cool. I got connected to Star Trek mostly through my talks actually to give fan talks at conventions. And then in 2019, as you said, Michelle Paradise took over season 3 of Star Trek Discovery, and she wanted to hire some scientists to work on that. And that went really well. And then they had all these other shows that were greenlit and under production. And they were like, well, we could just use a scientist on staff, essentially, to any shows who, as much or as little as they want to use me. And I've been doing that since then.
I have to say, like, first of all, I should be saying this offline, but whatever, it's fine. We have to hang out when I get back to LA because that's where I live full time. I'm only
Yes,
in
please.
Florida right now for my internship. There is an incredible group of people. We probably actually have some crossover with our friend groups, but there's an incredible group of scientists and science communicators in LA, many of whom are actually science writers on big TV shows that we all hang out all the time. And it's the best crew. It's such a cool confluence in Los Angeles of science education and a sort of freelance creative application of that science education. And it's so cool to see that you went that route as well. And you did it really like on your own. You forged it in a way that I assume you didn't have a whole lot of mentors along the way.
Not in the slightest. Not at all. Yeah, absolutely. It is funny. We probably are connected by 1 degree through about 8 different people, I'm going to guess.
Yeah, I would think so. Yeah. And we'll talk about them more offline when we finish the recording. But I love that so much. I mean, I'm so excited for you for like where your career is even continuing to head. Tell me a little bit. I'm just curious. As a science advisor, a consultant on Star Trek, actually the advisor on Star Trek, did you feel pressure or were you already comfortable with this of like knowing everything there was to know about all of the Star Trek canon and like the entire back catalog? Because I could imagine that would be a little bit daunting.
Yeah, so I was already a Star Trek fan. I really got into Star Trek hardcore when I was in graduate school. So like I had a pretty good understanding of the franchise under my belt. But it's really specific things. Like I mentioned season 3 of Discovery, a lot of what I was brought on to help with was developing science of dilithium, which dilithium is a made up Star Trek thing, but it's been around since Star Trek started in 1966. So I felt a heck of a lot of pressure to go back through and see that everything that we knew about dilithium, so I didn't counteract anything and then just grow it from there and sort of yes and what had already come. And that was a little stressful. Yeah. It does keep me up at night. I guess I'll put it that way.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, I think I would be overwhelmed by that too. But of course, you've got probably so much access now and so many people that you can turn to. And there's so much research material at your fingertips.
Oh yeah, for sure. Absolutely. And it's fun. I genuinely love it. I love the franchise, and like it's great to be able to roll up my sleeves. And then also just the honor of being able to add canon, to Star Trek. Like it's a franchise that everyone knows at least a little bit, like they know of its existence. And that's pretty
Yeah. Oh, for
cool.
sure. I
Yeah.
love that so much. I'm curious. I just said I wasn't going to bring up anybody's names, but I have a friend named named Shane Campbell Staton, and I bring him up, or Staten. I bring him up because he's been on the show before. Have you had a chance to meet Shane?
I don't think so. No, he doesn't sound
Okay.
familiar.
I have to connect the two of you because he's since left LA, sadly, and now I think he's like doing a big show for PBS, and he
Oh,
moved
cool.
to Jersey to start teaching out there. But he has a podcast called The Science of Superheroes, and also taught at UCLA. He's an evolutionary biologist and ecologist, but he teaches the science of superheroes. So there's like this
Awesome.
cool, I know, like parallel there.
Yeah.
You've got like the sci-fi side, and he's got the superhero side. You've got the
I love
physics,
it.
and he's got the biology.
That's so neat. Yeah. It's funny, you asked kind of like, I don't really have mentors for this job. I really did have a crisis in 2020, which we all had a crisis in 2020, but I had a professional crisis again because like I had that moment where it hit me where I was like, oh my God, like I'm the science advisor for Star Trek. Like as science advisors go, that's like the job, right? As an astrophysicist in LA. If you want to be a professional science advisor, like that's one of the best ones you can get. And so what do I do after this? This isn't going to be forever. And I was so lucky to be on a panel with two guys, Naren Shakar and Andre Bermanis, who were science advisors. Their first job in Hollywood was as science advisors for Star Trek back in the 80s and 90s. And they have gone on. Naren Shankar is the showrunner for The Expanse, and Andre Bermanis is an executive producer on The Orville and on Cosmos. And so I was so lucky to be able to have a conversation with them and to talk about like how to steer my career more in that direction, because that's where I felt myself drawn. I had this epiphany of like, oh no, I'm not meant to be Dana Scully. Like I'm meant to write Dana Scully's, for future generations. And so that's kind of where I decided to pivot and start focusing my career more on getting behind the scenes as a writer as opposed to a science advisor.
Oh, I love that. I also have a great friend who's got a PhD from Caltech who's a science writer, and I have to introduce you to her. Not in physics, though, in also like neuro and stuff like that. Oh my gosh, this is so very exciting. So then you started like how what's the jump to making a kid's book? Like how did that happen? Because obviously that's sort of why your publicist got in touch with my assistant. This is how it often happens. Like I get a bunch of books sent to me, the books go across, and then I read about the authors like, oh, this is really interesting. Oh, this looks good. And usually we don't do kids' books on the show that much because it's not a kid's show. But you yourself are so interesting. The science of Star Trek, but like in kid form is super interesting.
Well,
so I'm just curious, Star Trek, my first book of space, how did that come about?
Yeah. So while I've been working behind the scenes, I've also continued to do a lot of fan outreach. So I go to all the licensed Star Trek events. I did Star Trek Mission Chicago. I did the Star Trek Cruise a few times now. And one of the people that I met on that was my good friend, Rob Perlman. Rob has written a ton of very just sort of fun, pop culture books. Like he wrote Dunder Mifflin Elementary School. Like he writes all these sort of quirky stuff. And he's been a Star Trek writer, licensed writer in that vein for a long time. So he wrote like Fun with Kirk and Spock as like Fun with Dick and Jane, the Adventures of Red Shirts. So just like quirky little holiday type gifts. And he had always wanted to write a like baby board book for Star Trek. And then we were just hanging out at these events that we do. And the idea kind of came to write a steam package. So STEM plus arts. And he's like, well, 4 of those 5 letters I can't do, but I can do the art. And if you can do the space, and he kind of pitched it and they picked it up. And so we wrote them independently. I wrote my first book of space. He wrote my first book of colors, but they're illustrated by the same person and they came out together. So they make this nice little package together as gifts. And it's been really exciting to kind of just see the reception to it.
I love that. And so tell me a little bit about what it took to write for kids. Like, is this an area where you've been interested in the past? Is it a place where you felt like you had any sort of expertise? Did you have to really learn on the fly?
Well, thankfully, I briefly mentioned that after I left academia, I worked at a museum part-time. That really, I would say, honed my SciComm skills, my science communication skills, because 3 or 4 days a week, 7 hours a day, I just interfaced with the public and answered space questions. And it could be a 5-year-old who's just learned about black holes, or like a retired aerospace engineer who wants to know about the Mars mission. So I really developed a good skill for communicating scientific ideas to the right audience. I like to think anyway. But I will say there's kids' books, and then there's 0 to 2 range.
Yeah, it's very different.
That was hard. That was a good challenge, because the only brief was okay, Erin, write a space book for 0 to 2-year-olds, and you have 11 pages to do it in. And one of the things that I am personally passionate about with space education is this idea of the cosmological address. I think so many people learn about space in school and they kind of stop at the solar system. You learn the planets, you learn, and that we live in a Milky Way galaxy, sort of these facts, but you don't really have the bigger context. And so I tried to take that and kind of structure the book around it. So we really start at Earth and then move out from there into things that we don't actually know. We're still studying. So we had kind of this funny conversation where I sent my little sentence, my little page on dark matter to Rob, and he just came back to me and he was like, well, Erin, is there anything more we can say about dark matter? And I had to just be like, no, Rob, we literally like humanity doesn't know any more than that. we don't know what dark matter is. And so what excites me is that, I've had all this feedback from people who, yes, it's a baby board book. Yes, it's pretty. It's got cool colors. But I'm hearing that, people who have kids who are 6 or 7 are really liking the book because there's hard new words in it and they can read it themselves. And then adults are messaging me being like, oh, I never knew that. That's really cool.
I love that.
Yeah. So I was excited to kind of take a slightly different approach to space for kids. It's focused beyond just our solar system.
Oh, yeah. And that's great because, like you said, there is this kind of narrow view. And I think what we don't realize is that sometimes in saying, okay, this is something graspable, this is something that seems like an easier, good starting point, and then it's reinforced over and over and over for years and years and years, that by the time we are adults and we sort of have this expanded capacity, we're very set in our mentality about what we learned when we were children.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's well said. Absolutely.
That's so important. And I think it's I'm actually I'm at a loss for words because I feel like this is a lot deeper, than we're even making it out to be here. But in underestimating children's capacities, we're often stunting adults.
Agreed. I absolutely think so. And it's important too, especially when it comes to science, that the way we talk about science and the way we approach it in our society is just that it's you learn it in school and then you've learned it and you passed the test and that was it. And now you know astronomy, and I have relatives, I won't say who because they'll come and kill me, but they haven't, the last time they took an astronomy class was before we landed on the moon.
Right.
And how much space we've learned since then and how much our understanding of science has changed since then, and that science is an evolving process. And that doesn't mean it's wrong or untrustworthy. It means that we're continually learning.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. No, totally. Ugh. Ugh. What an important, I don't know, thing we just tapped into.
It's very, very philosophical.
Yes. My show often tends to be. And I love it when I can get philosophical with physicists as well. But of course, you get philosophical all the time in the work that you do because, yes, as a science advisor or as a consultant or as a writer, it's important that you get the science right, but it's also important that you like prioritize the storytelling and the themes and the takeaways and the relationships between the characters and all that good stuff.
Absolutely. A lot of times, my role as a science advisor is not to add on all this cool extra science, but to say, like, you know what? Let's not explain that. Like, let's
Mhm.
just let it be, because if you do try to explain it, you're going to lose people. You're going to pull them out of the story. It's going to distract from it. We're going to be making up a bunch of stuff that really doesn't lend itself. Like, the emotion takes precedent, then the characters, then the sort of sciencey technical aspect of it. So we really have to find those points where, we just either don't explain it. It's a lot of my role is just making sure we don't say anything wrong. you know,
Exactly. Yeah, it's
that's
not
my
so much
main
about
job.
over explaining, it's about not making like an egregious error that's like, well, that's not possible.
Yeah, exactly. And I do think like a lot of the writers really appreciate just having me there for that feedback, that we can bounce ideas around. And some stuff it becomes almost, I mean, it's literally a writer's room. But we will like start yes anding each other, right? And with my perspective from the astronomy and physics aspect, we can quickly throw out ideas that are only going to get us in trouble and start growing the ones that do have potential, or I like to say it's a backbone in science, that we can then
Yeah.
start piling the story on top of that.
Yeah, very cool. And so I'm assuming that you can't really tell us anything that you're actively working on right now.
Well, there's still Star Trek episodes and shows coming out. Star
Okay.
Trek Prodigy is airing right now. I highly recommend people check that out, especially if they found this because of the kids' book, because it's the first Star Trek show directed for kids.
Mhm.
Um,
Oh, very cool.
it's really neat. It's really special to me. It's fun. The animation is stunningly beautiful, and it's just got some neat kind of stories. And you can come into it without ever really knowing any Star Trek, because that's how it was designed. It was to introduce kids to this world and this universe. So that's been great. And then we also have Star Trek Picard season 3. The last season is starting next year. For those TNG fans out there, the next generation, that's going to have a lot of fun stuff for you in that. And Star Trek Discovery is coming back. Strange New Worlds is coming back. Lower Decks is coming back. There's so much good Star Trek out there these days.
I love that. And what about you in terms of books? Is that something where you think you want to put more of your effort into it? Was it like a one and done and that was exciting, or do you think it's something you're going to kind of focus your career on?
No, it's fun. It's been really good for me to explore writing, because I always had this, like, I love storytelling, but I would try to write novels and I just really could never get through that. And so right now I'm having these opportunities to write in different mediums and genres. I obviously found a huge love for television writing, but being able to write these sort of nonfiction, but still pop culture themed books, I would really like to continue writing in that vein, that books that feel fun and accessible, but people still learn stuff from them. So maybe like another space Star Trek type book that's for slightly older, audience would
Oh,
be
I
would
love
be the
that.
fun
Yeah.
project. Yeah.
Very cool. Well, listen, Erin, when we start to wrap up, kind of get towards the end of the hour, I often ask my guests the same two big questions, and we're about to dive into that. But before we do, I'm wondering if there's anything that you feel like we didn't cover, anything that you're like, come on, Cara, why didn't we talk about this?
No, man, we talked on some cool stuff. I think I think I'd like to just emphasize really that there's a lot of power in using television and movies to teach. whether it comes from representation of people seeing themselves as professions that they wouldn't see otherwise, or just using these reference points where we can talk about why a lightsaber couldn't work or why artificial gravity could work. You can use these as really good reference points to make science more accessible. So if people are in the science communication vein, don't shy away from using fiction to teach. I think it's really effective.
Yeah, no, agree 100%. Love that. So listen, I want to know, and these are, speaking of getting philosophical before, I'm going to ask you some kind of big picture questions.
Okay.
I want you to think about the future. And obviously, that's something that you often have to do in your work, but you can do it in whatever context feels relevant. It can be personal, it can be like literally the future of humanity, it can be the future of the cosmos, whatever context makes sense to you. And I'm going to ask you two things. The first is, when you think about the future, what is the thing that keeps you up the most at night? The thing that you're most concerned about, worried, maybe even pessimistic, maybe even cynical about? And then, so, on the flip side, we end on a more positive note. Where are you actually finding your hope, your positivity? What are you actually looking forward to?
Ooh, those
Mm,
are big questions.
I know it. I'm such a jerk.
um, yeah, I think the thing that keeps me up at night is, I study space. Space is like nihilistic, but in a really sudden way. Like space is really dangerous and scary, but if it kills you, it's going to come out of nowhere. Like we're not going to
Yeah.
have any sign for that. So that doesn't scare me as much. I've done like apocalyptic talking head things before, and they always have to tell me to stop looking so excited when I talk about like solar flares or asteroids or anything like that. Um, but more seriously, I would say like I really struggle. I think especially in the last couple of years, my father is a climate scientist, and then to see how so many people responded to a global pandemic, the selfishness and the arrogance that we have towards this planet and to nature and what it's capable of doing, and realizing that like so many people just look out for themselves in a way that is killing the planet and is killing other people, is really upsetting. And I think I was fortunate enough to be raised in a household where, when talking about climate change in the 80s and 90s had this sort of label of like fear mongering or being too extreme a view. I was raised in an environment that had a lot of, my dad would explain to me why we talk about this stuff. And so I know where it can go, and I knew the signs to look for, and the fact that like we're already over those limits, and the unpredictability of our climate and what this world is going to look like just from like a climate perspective in the next 5 years is really scary. And I'm like, when I say 5 years, I mean 5 years. We're already having major weather disasters that we can't predict or control or understand when they're happening and why they're happening. And so that keeps me up at night.
Absolutely.
It's
Yeah.
very stressful.
Same. 100%.
Yeah.
Is it keep you up so much that you can't see the light, or are there things that you find yourself being able to hold on to?
Um, in that respect, I can't see the light, but the way I cope with it is just by trying. I mean, from the pragmatic aspect of trying to deal with that, like I just try to do the best I can and try to um, contribute and look out for people and not become selfish and self-absorbed myself. But more realistically, and I don't ascribe any shame to this, but being able to escape into storytelling, I think helps a lot. I think
Mhm.
that, I have a tattoo on my arm. I was obsessed with Alan Rickman growing up. Like he was
Mhm.
my teenage crush. And after he passed, I got a quote that he said that it's a human need to be told stories. And I really feel like that's what keeps us going when we've lost all other hope, is to tell stories. Um, from a scientific standpoint, I think the thing that excites me is the possibility of there being other life out there, which I know is sort of a broad, non-generic statement, but genuinely, when you think about it, like we are so small. And just the idea that there's other planets out there, there's other species, there's other people just living their own lives, just really fascinates me. And it allows me to kind of, it's like that existential crisis almost allows me to calm down and just be like, we're so small. Life is short. Just make the most of it. Do what you can to help other people. Live on this tiny little rock that's orbiting a big ball of plasma. And
Yeah, it's such a
yeah,
perspective shift.
it really is. And it helps. For me, it helps.
Agree. And I think for people who think really deeply about these things and who reflect on sort of their place in the cosmos, and they reflect on their, however they define their own purpose, their own meaning, what life means to them, that smallness within the vastness can really bring you to a place of, I don't know, awe, a place of depth, and a place of like emotion.
Yeah, we ascribe existential crisis to so many bad that we think of it like a bad thing, but I don't think it's really a crisis in the same way. It's just this existential being. You just realize how
Absolutely.
small we are, and that's
And so
okay.
you're touching on all the things that it's so funny because I didn't give you any of this info at the top of the show. Now here we are at the end, and everybody listening is rolling their eyes. They're like, "Okay, Cara, we've heard you say this before." But my PhD is in clinical psychology, and my orientation is existential. So I am an existential psychotherapist.
That's
like
amazing.
what I actually do with my clients.
Oh my God.
Full
I've
circle,
walked into
baby.
it. That is perfect.
I love it so much. Yeah. All right. Well, on that note, Erin, I have to thank you so much for being here with us today. It is your book is Star Trek, My First Book of Space. I think it just dropped a couple of months ago, so it's available wherever you buy books right now. Everybody who wants to learn more, where can they kind of find you? Social media, or like where's your internet presence where you would want to direct them to?
Oh, my internet presence is currently wandering. It has gone on a journey the last couple of weeks. Normally, I was very active on Twitter. I am not so active on Twitter anymore.
Fair, yeah, for good reason.
Yeah. I am on Instagram just posting occasional random things, but that's probably the easiest place for people to find me. It's at Dr. Erin Mac, DrErinMac, and just look out for my name in Star Trek credits.
Oh, and by the way, do you pronounce it that way, Macdonald or McDonald?
Macdonald.
Macdonald. Okay.
Old Highland way. Yes.
I love it. All right. Well, there she is, everyone. Dr. Erin Macdonald. Thank you so much for being here with us today.
Thanks for having me.
And everyone listening, thank you for coming back week after week. I'm really looking forward to the next time we all get together to talk nerdy.